Oh, good evening. Let's get our Bibles out and going to finish one book and start another tonight. Finish 1 Samuel chapter 31. Jump to a whole new book, 2 Samuel chapter 1, picking right back up where we finished before. So very good to have everyone with us. Have our online people with us too. Glad to have you here. Before we get started, Rob said yes, so he'd do it. Thank you, Rob. Rob, lead us in a word of prayer.
Thank you, Father, for this time that we have come together this evening to study a portion of your word, or continuation in the book of Samuel, Father. Be with Brian this evening as he brings this lesson. Let us put aside the thoughts of the outside now and focus in on our lesson, be participatory in it, and hopefully we can glean something out of it, Father, that we can make applicable to our lives. We give you thanks for everything you give us. In Christ's holy name.
Amen. Thank you very much. 1 Samuel chapter 31. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him. He was severely wounded by the archers. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust it in through me, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me." So we've been talking for the last few chapters about how this war has been building up, this battle between the Philistines and the Israelites, and how they've been terrified of this to the degree that we saw a couple of chapters ago, how Saul even went to somebody practicing witchcraft and tried to get answers from somebody who was dead about what they needed to do or what the future held for him. And just like they said, Saul has died. Now, one of the things that's really difficult to grab here is the idea, too, of how it is that it's not just Saul that dies, but Jonathan as well. And I've often wondered, if I had been Saul and I had heard that, tomorrow you and your sons will join me, I might have at least tried to keep my sons from joining that fate. But, we've seen Saul to be a guy that's not shown the great affection for his children, perhaps, or perhaps he just knew that it wasn't something to escape. I think there's something really poignant there about the fact that his sons all died before him, and that significance doesn't escape me. How old do you think Saul was here? I was wondering, you can kind of put some things together, or you can make some good guesses. What do you think about Saul's age? You're probably not going to come to a specific answer, but I was wondering if somebody could give us a sense.
Online it says about 72.
About 70 or 72 years old.
But I found it interesting that King James and the New American Standard and other translations are different. Some say that he was 30 when he began to read, he ran for 40.
Yeah.
King James talks about 1 year and 2 years.
Yeah, that's a messy verse way back when it said Saul reigned 1 year and 2 years. That actually is it's kind of interesting. We didn't talk too much about that verse in class because that's it's a really confusing passage, and there's not a lot of easy way to understand it. I don't know if you agree. Yeah, it was interesting to read up that. So we kind of get a sense Saul might be around 70 years old. So he's not a young guy. And I told you before that Jonathan, especially if he's the oldest, Jonathan's probably quite a bit older than David was even. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about as well. He has children, of course. We'll talk about them. Stan puts down 50 to 60 years old. And Stan makes the point, say, if he's older, would he have been in the battle? And that's a good point too. I'd say minimum of 60 because he's been king for 40 years, and I don't think he would have been younger than 20 to be king. But I think 30 is the language of the scripture to give us that sense too. So it's kind of interesting to say why. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Well, plus an older guy like that who's the leader and all that, they generally kind of sit up on the hill. They're not involved directly hand to hand. He got hit with an arrow. So
what does that tell you, Rob, about him getting hit with an arrow? That's a good. Your comment's great, Rob. Imagine.
Might be a little distance from
that. Yeah. So who died first then? In battle, who died? his sons. So I kind of get the impression, Rob, and I'm wondering if that's what you're describing too. His sons are down in the thick of it. They're killed. But now as the battle moves out, maybe Saul is afar off. I mean, if I'm thinking of an older man, I'm how am I going to say this delicately? George and I go into battle. I don't know if George will be right up in front or not.